Today's episode is brought to you by Stillwater from Focus Features, starring Matt Damon and directed by Tom McCarthy. Only in theaters July 30th. Stillwater is the most powerful motion picture of the summer. Matt Damon plays Bill Baker, a blue-collar worker from Oklahoma who must travel to Marseille, France to exonerate his estranged daughter from a murder charge. Secrets run deep. Stillwater, in theaters July 30th.
Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Monday, March 22nd. With us on this Monday morning, we have White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire, the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton joins us, staff writer at The Atlantic magazine and author of the book, Twilight of Democracy. Anne Applebaum joins us this morning. Also with us, U.S. national editor at the Financial Times, Ed Luce. And we begin this morning with the official who led the Justice Department's investigation of the January 6th Capitol riot, now saying the evidence supports charges of sedition. In a 60 Minutes interview that aired last night, Michael Sherwin, the interim U.S. attorney who stepped down from the investigation on Friday, was asked why more people weren't being charged with sedition and whether prosecutors are looking into former President Trump's role in the riot. Take a look.
Seems like a very low bar, and I wonder why you're not charging that now.
Okay, so I don't think it's a low bar, Scott, but I will tell you this. I personally believe the evidence is trending towards that and probably meets those elements.
Do you anticipate sedition charges against some of these suspects?
I believe the facts do support those charges, and I think that as we go forward, more facts will support that, Scott.
Has the role of former President Trump been part of your investigation?
Well, we have soccer moms from Ohio that were arrested saying, well, I did this because my president said I had to take back our house. That moves the needle towards that direction. Maybe the president is culpable for those actions, but also you see in the public record too, militia members saying, you know what? We did this because Trump just talks a big game. He's just all talk. We did what he wouldn't do.
In short, you have investigators looking into the president's role.
We have people looking at everything.
Sherwin has resumed his position as federal prosecutor in Miami. Meanwhile, the New York Times yesterday released a report using D.C. police radio communications synchronized with footage at the scene showing the real-time struggle of officers trying to protect the Capitol on January 6th.
We're not here for you. We're here for America.
The Capitol Police Force requests backup.
Anyone...
These internal radio communications are from the reinforcements, officers from D.C.'s Municipal Police Force, or MPD, who were called in to help the Capitol Police.
Cruiser 50, 64, 54, mount up.
Cruiser 50 is the call sign for the leader of the MPD response, Inspector Robert Glover, a high-ranking MPD veteran who specializes in crowd control and high-stakes confrontations. Over the next 76 minutes, the MPD radio communications, synchronized with footage from the scene analyzed by the New York Times, reveal the gauntlet Glover and his team face, trying to hold the line at the Capitol.
Multiple capital injuries. Multiple capital injuries.
It's been 5 minutes since Glover's team arrived, and already he's calling in officer injuries. He hears from other police on the radio who warn that the situation is about to get even worse.
Be advised of speed and vision.
Now that President Trump has left the stage at the other end of the National Mall, crowds of people are streaming toward the Capitol.
Intel would be advised you got a group of about 50 charging up the hill on the left front.
Glover is still asking for the munitions unit.
Cruiser 50, give me DSO up here now! DSO!
Injuries are mounting.
Multiple law enforcement injuries! DSO, get up there!
Police escalate their response and start using more crowd control weapons.
They're shooting into their own people! We represent blue lives and this is what they do to us!
Multiple deployments by Capitol MPD! One anything more to point out crimes to hold the line.
Let's bring in New York Times reporter and MSNBC national security analyst Michael Schmidt, who contributed to this real-time look at what officers were going through that day trying to protect the Capitol on January the 6th. Mike, as you pieced all this together, what did you learn?
I think the most important thing about Hold the Line, about what it was like to be on the front lines of this fight, is the sustained nature of this. Most interactions, most violent interactions that officers have happen pretty quickly. They happen over a matter of seconds. Sometimes they happen over a matter of minutes. Sometimes there's an extended version of that. But officers rarely confront hand-to-hand combat like soldiers over hours and hours. And the fact that these officers were thrust into this situation is just such an unusual challenge to them. It's just so different than anything they have had to experience before. And that trauma, the fact that it went on so long, is one of the reasons that you've had so many injuries, why you had so many severe injuries, things that we usually do not see officers having to experience in normal day-to-day American policing. And to be able to see through the eyes of these officers that were there trying to hold the line, and what happens when the line is breached and they eventually have to retreat. And certainly, obviously, this knocks out any of these conspiratorial notions that have been pushed about the fact that these Trump supporters were not violent and such. I mean, these ridiculous claims. But unfortunately, we live in this society where showing this video is just so important to the bare bone facts of what went on.
Well, and Applebaum, the timing of not only this report being released by the New York Times, but also the 60 Minutes interview last night lines up, unfortunately, all too well with your piece in The Atlantic. The science of making Americans hurt their own country. And this isn't something that just happened in the week leading up to January the 6th. There's propaganda coming in from Russia, propaganda coming in from across the world, trying to divide Americans, and again, for those talking Russian hoax, I remember listening to General Mike Hayden in 2017 talking about how it was very clear that Russians were trying to divide us along lines to create exactly this type of incident, this type of response to something that in the past would have been debated on television or in letters to the editor.
Yes, so I wrote that piece really in response to an intelligence analysis that was published a few days ago about the 2020 election, showing the way in which, most of which we saw play out in real time, in which Russian intelligence officers gave Rudy Giuliani information that he then passed on to far-right media and Fox in order to discredit Joe Biden and his family. Right. You're right that the science of how to divide Americans is something that outsiders have studied for a long time. How to feed conspiracy theories, how to create anger. I think the Capitol riot is unfortunately an illustration of how well domestic media has internalized those same methods. The creation of alternative worlds in which people live in, most of the people you saw at the Capitol live in an alternative world in which they believe that Trump won the election. They don't have they don't see other kinds of news, or they've learned to disregard other kinds of news. The tactics that, originally Russian tactics are now internalized by Americans and used that way. So, you have outside forces and internal forces really cooperating together in a number of different ways.
And internalized by people like Republican Senator Ron Johnson, who keeps playing down the severity of the January 6th attacks on the Capitol. Last week, he said he was never threatened.
Really?
We'd been more concerned if the marchers were from Black Lives Matter. At a local political event over the weekend, he made another false claim, lying to the crowd, saying there was much more violence on the House side. There was no violence in the Senate side in terms of the chamber. Here's a photo of a man dressed in combat gear inside the Senate chamber with zip ties. Here's a report from the Washington Post, actually with more on the threat to the Senate specifically.
Lawmakers in both the House and Senate chambers are meeting to certify electoral votes for President-elect Joe Biden.
To assign different electors to a state.
Outside, a man uses a police shield to smash a window. He was seen earlier that day with members of the Proud Boys, a far-right group with a history of violence. A group from the crowd enters the Capitol, a floor below where the Senate is in session. A minute later, at 2:13, Pence is ushered off the Senate floor to a nearby office. Senate President Pro Tem Charles E. Grassley begins presiding, but almost immediately calls a recess.
And it will stand in recess until the call of the chair.
We'll pause.
Protesters are in the building.
At that moment, one floor below the Senate chamber, rioters enter and begin pursuing a lone Capitol police officer, Eugene Goodman, up a staircase to the second floor. They are nearing the chamber, which is filled with lawmakers. The rioters at one point pass within 100 feet of where Pence is huddled with his family. Goodman leads the mob away from a nearby entrance to the chamber and toward a line of police.
Really tricked them.
Again, Ann Applebaum, you have a United States senator falsely telling supporters that there wasn't much violence on the House side, or there wasn't much violence on the Senate side in terms of the chamber, and Ron Johnson spreading disinformation, it seems almost every day. And again, this is not a new phenomenon. Of course, there was another Wisconsin senator who did the same thing back in the 1950s. But certainly he seems to be taking his cues, again, from a lot of disinformation coming from other sources.
No, look, I mean, what we saw at the Capitol was not Republicans versus Democrats. It wasn't partisanship in the way that we're used to thinking of it. It wasn't a right-left battle. It was a group of people who were against the system itself. They were trying to prevent Congress from recognizing and naming the next president. So they were actually an anti-systemic, anti-democratic group. And in order to sustain their new ideology, as I said, they live in a kind of alternate reality. And one of the most dangerous things that's happening now is that there are people who are elected, who are in power, people who know better, who continue to sustain this group because they see that it might have partisan political advantage. If they can keep that group going, if they can keep them energized, they think they can use that to win elections. And that's very scary. It's one of the first times in recent American history that we've had American politicians seeking to energize anti-democratic or anti-American, groups of people who are against our elections and against our political system as a political tool.
Yeah. And Joe, I mean, Ron Johnson's behavior, his comments, are they seditious? Are they supporting sedition? Because it's just appalling that there's no check and balance on this type of language on the floor.
Well, obviously, if it's on the floor, that is going to be protected.
Or to the media.
Well, at the end of the day, most politicians end up answering to their voters. But in this case, we've been showing video throughout the day, remarkable video from the New York Times, remarkable video from the Washington Post, lining all of these things up. And if you look at the definition of sedition, being in a conspiracy to commit sedition, it lines up perfectly with what we've seen. We saw a picture of Mike Pence presiding over the United States Senate, James Langford talking. We saw people breaking into the Senate windows down below. Sedition, of course, if you look at the federal statute, it's where you act to cause a disruption or to stop a legal process, whether it's passing legislation or a constitutional process. That is exactly what's going on here at Luce. And if you look at these tapes that Mike Schmitz talked about, if you look at the New York Times tapes and all the others, and you look at the time code and you see the intent, which is clearly to stop the constitutional process of counting these electoral ballots. And what we heard last night on 60 Minutes actually lines up with the law. This is a textbook definition of sedition.
For sure it is. I don't think there's any question of that in any reasonable mind, whether they're prosecutors or people who've been paying attention to what's been coming out on video and in terms of the indictments of these 400 or so people so far that have been indicted. I think the concern here is that there's not going to be any way to get to the top of this. We're going to get to the bottom in terms of Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and various neo-Confederate groups that were clearly, conspiring, and there are transcripts of, encrypted communications between them. There was clearly a plan here to do what happened. The concern is that those who are ultimately responsible for goading and inciting this unprecedented attack on democracy in the United States, starting with Donald Trump, are going to get off scot-free. And once that is the case, then people like Ron Johnson, are going to thrive in this environment. You mentioned, the Wisconsin background and Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy was ultimately shunned by his own colleagues. He went too far. He discomforted even some hardline Republicans who were with him. Ron Johnson isn't yet being shunned by anybody. He's in a party where this is still acceptable rhetoric, where there are no heads being bowed in shame, where if you look at the House side, you have a QAnon caucus sort of building up. And so I think the concern here is you want prosecutors to get to the top of this, not just to the bottom of it. And I don't know how easy that's going to be or whether there is any political will to do that.
Yeah, and Jonathan Lemire, I know it sounds bizarre, certainly bizarre to people like Ann and myself who grew up either in families filled with Cold Warriors or who actually worked to help in small or large ways during the Cold War. But you've actually got Republicans, these anti-democratic forces that Ann's talking about, and you could go through it chapter and verse over the past several years about how we talk about Russian disinformation, but you actually have people on the far right who are actually supportive of Vladimir Putin. I mean, there are polls you can Google right now that show how Vladimir Putin's approval rating shot up in the Republican Party when Donald Trump was president. But you can also see during the Ukraine-Russia skirmishes, right-wing commentators cheering against Ukraine, cheering for Russia. You see other people this past week actually bizarrely cheering for a Putin-Biden debate.
Come on.
And bizarrely saying that Biden would be wiped out by Putin. Many of them are now puffing up Vladimir Putin in the same way that they've puffed up Donald Trump. It is bizarre, and I'd love to get your input and your insight on it.
Yeah, Joe, it's extraordinary. For some years now, Putin had really gained popularity among the real fringes of the right, because his hypermasculinity and whiteness and strength, that image that he likes to portray. But what's happened during the Trump administration is that kind of crossed over into somewhat more mainstream Republican views. Not all, of course. but some on the right suddenly sort of sided with Putin and suggested that he was one to be emulated. And certainly Trump himself fawned over the Russian president time after time. And we know how deferential he was on matters of election interference and not. And even though Trump is now off the stage and no longer president, this hasn't gone away. And you're right. What we've seen the last few days, after Joe Biden called Vladimir Putin a killer, which was sort of a shocking moment of diplomacy, if you will, but one that's certainly accurate. We know Putin, ex-KGB, and the way the Russians have poisoned dissidents there in their own country. And the Kremlin hit back, and Putin indeed challenged Biden to this debate. And we've seen this phenomenon where some on the right, including some hosts on Fox News, seem to be cheering Putin on, or at the very least suggesting Biden was a coward for not taking him up on this, which is an extraordinary thing. And certainly we are now seeing Republican senators like Ron Johnson spout this disinformation. With Trump's Twitter account offline, Johnson seems to be the go-to source right now of just this sheer nonsense, this baseless accusations and assertions about January 6th. A moment now that, as a final note, perhaps again, carry some legal danger for the president. That the focus of late for Donald Trump had been about New York and his business interests, and maybe even Georgia. But now, listening to that interview from 60 Minutes last night, perhaps the former president has legal concerns out of Washington, too.
Yeah, and Ann, let me go back to you, because it's something that obviously you follow very closely. None of us could have ever believed that you would have had a major party actually cheering on Vladimir Putin or cheering on Russia in wars with Ukraine, or cheering on Vladimir Putin when it came to a bizarre debate challenge, or actually having senators spreading disinformation after being warned by intel agencies not to spread that disinformation because it was connected to Putin. They would be doing Putin's work, and yet they continue to do that.
It's interesting, a few decades ago, we would have been talking about exactly the opposite phenomenon. We would have been talking about elements of the far left and their fascination with the Soviet Union. Everything the Soviet Union did was good. Everything the United States did was bad. Now we have a similar phenomenon where there's some on the far right, and as you say, some even in Congress, who have a similar fascination with modern Russia. And it comes out of a dislike of their own country. They don't like what modern America is, and they see some kind of ideal abroad. I mean, and it's funny because just as the left never really understood the Soviet Union, the right now doesn't understand or know much about Russia. I mean, Russia, they imagine it's some kind of a white Christian, nativist nationalist country. It's actually a country with a big Muslim population, and including one part of the country, Chechnya, is actually run by Sharia law. I mean, it's not just a piece of information. That's actually how it's run. It's a country that represses some Christian groups. It will arrest evangelicals. So it's not a country of religious freedom. It's not a good place for Christians at all. It's a country that, as you say, arrests and murders dissidents, some including some who are outside the country. So they actually use poison to kill people who have left Russia. And yet, as I say, there's a part of the far right that now imagines somehow, because Russia's on their side, they can use Russia in their partisan wars inside the United States. It's a bizarre phenomenon, and I'm hoping that the more patriotic, mainstream members of the Republican Congress will start to fight back against it.
Reverend Al, there are, of course, concerns as we look at all of these tapes about the anti-democratic forces, the illiberalism that you've seen not only during the rise of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, but also, as Anna's documented so well, and others have, in Poland, in Hungary, and anti-democratic forces. We saw those anti-democratic forces on January the 6th. We're also seeing anti-democratic forces, not as dramatically. They're trying to pass legislation, but still anti-democratic forces who are trying to pass legislation that's going to restrict voting because they believe the only way they can get elected. I'm talking about Republican legislatures across the country. The only way their candidates can be elected is by restricting the vote as much as possible and getting as few people voting as possible, because this is a party that I believe has lost 7 of the last 8 popular votes in presidential contests.
When you look at the laws that are being proposed in over 40 states to suppress votes, it is in the same spirit of people that feel that they can engage in outright sedition because they want to have their way and their rule in this country. I think what is the most disturbing part is how people that you would consider in the past mainstream Republicans tolerate this, both in the state legislators and when you see a Senator Johnson in the Senate that says outright that if the same kind of crowd was outside had been Black Lives Matter or Antifa, I would have been concerned. These people are patriots. Not that these people were there clearly behaving in a violent, seditious manner. The 60 Minutes tape tells us the evidence even goes that way. But the color of their skin and the fact that they are on our side in an us against them battle, and this we're beginning to see demonstrated around the country and duplicated around the world. This is very disturbing because it's a threat to democracy itself.
And Michael Schmidt, you actually interviewed people at the riot. There were people interviewed at the riot, and you in this analysis followed the movements of Oath Keepers. Tell us what you found and just how organized this assault on American democracy was. And again, we're bringing this up. Obviously, there's a new explosive New York Times report out last night. 60 Minutes had, I think, not shocking information, but important information that a lot of these people are probably going to be brought up on sedition charges. And so we're getting more perspective on this event as we move forward, just as we've been saying for months we were going to. What did you see in reviewing the tape and following the path of these Oath Keepers? How organized was this assault on American democracy?
Well, I think that's the thing that has stood out not only in the footage, but also in the court documents that have come out, just about how much this was not just such a, a spontaneous thing that just happened to crop up of, people that were sort of riled up, that this was really a premeditated event. And it was something that the president, basically took his base. He dipped his base in lighter fluid for many weeks and then lit the match himself. I think the thing that stuck out with me about all of this stuff that we're talking about and Ron Johnson and where we are as a country is that there's a sort of a new version of this coming out of Johnson's mouth. And the Times takes that on today in a story about him. And that's him basically, not encouraging people to take the vaccine. It's using the same tactics that have been used about the election and applying them to the vaccine. My colleagues who talked to Johnson for this profile they did of him asked him about the vaccine, and he basically gives this sort of thing. Well, there's a lot of questions, and was unwilling to go along with encouraging people to take the vaccine. And as we know, the biggest problem among many problems that the country has is getting that former president's Trump's base to take the vaccine. And here you are having the person who has assumed the mantle from Trump of the disinformation really casting doubt on the vaccine. And that has obviously enormous implications.
All right, Michael Schmidt, thank you so much for coming on this morning with your reporting. The real-time look at what officers went through trying to protect the Capitol on January 6th is online right now.
And the people doing this were the ones chanting Blue Lives Matter? Really?
Ann Applebaum, thank you very much as well. We'll be reading your latest piece for The Atlantic on the science of making Americans hurt their own country. Still ahead on Morning Joe, brand new data about AstraZeneca's coronavirus vaccine. Could the United States soon have a fourth vaccination option? Plus, a state of emergency in Miami Beach as spring breakers overwhelm the city. Also, the latest from the southern border as Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas hits the airwaves to defend Biden's immigration strategy. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Our world is facing some big challenges. Chuck Todd breaks them down. A deep dive into a new topic.
Instead of covering all the big stories, we're going to cover one single subject impacting American politics.
Exploring and explaining the critical issues that affect our future. Meet the Press Reports. All episodes of Season 2 are now available on demand on Peacock.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes. This week on my podcast, Why Is This Happening? I'll be talking with Palestinian-American scholar and author and historian Rashid Khalidi on the state of Palestinian politics in this moment.
A two-state solution is not going to happen, at least not until there are changes inside Israel, not unless and until. The status quo is a one-state solution. That's the state of Israel. There's one population register. Israel controls it. You cannot come in, you cannot go out, you cannot register a child, you cannot marry anywhere within that territory unless they approve. There's an illusion of a Palestinian authority, which is a mirage in terms of real sovereignty, jurisdiction, authority. It exists. It performs some governmental services on sufferance, by permission, but its main job is to keep the Palestinians down, to provide security for Israel as it continues to occupy and colonize.
That's this week on Why Is This Happening? Search for Why Is This Happening wherever you're listening right now and subscribe.
That'll teach you.
Welcome back to Morning Joe. Look at that beautiful sunrise over Washington, D.C. It is 33 past the hour. Even a little traffic. It's kind of hopeful. All right, former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago Club in Palm Beach, Florida, remains partially closed due to at least one positive COVID-19 case, according to a current staffer. Members of the staff were alerted to the closure via phone calls and emails early Friday, and some have been asked to quarantine. Service is suspended in the club's dining room and beach club, but banquet and event services remain open. Okay, let's go to a party. It remains unclear for how long. Trump's official office has not yet responded to requests for comment.
I'm not sure why we did that story, but go ahead.
Also in Florida, Miami Beach has declared a state of emergency.
This is a little more relevant.
In an effort to prevent an uptick in COVID cases similar to last year's spring break surge. The city is currently enforcing an evening curfew and other COVID restrictions. Look at this.
Looks like TJ's backyard on a weekend.
This is a lot of people. Okay. However, the pandemic has not stopped tourists from flocking to Miami Beach. Police have made more than 1,000 arrests since February 3rd, more than 50 over the past weekend. Police officers did anticipate an influx of travelers and increased restrictions, but the measures did little to curb large gatherings. My goodness.
What could go wrong?
That's a super spreader. And this morning, new data has been released from a large clinical trial of AstraZeneca's coronavirus vaccine in the United States. It shows the vaccine is 79% effective in preventing symptomatic illness and offers complete protection against severe disease and hospitalization. AstraZeneca says it will continue to analyze the data and prepare to submit analysis to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for emergency use authorization in the coming weeks.
So, Ed Luce, this has become a real crisis in Europe, obviously, over the past several weeks because of the real concerns of blood clotting and the concerns that actually across Europe, the vaccine that they put so much faith in was not as effective. But there's been a U-turn. Tell us about it.
Yeah, the AstraZeneca thing has been complicated by the fact that it's partly British. It's the Oxford University in collaboration with this Anglo-Swedish company, AstraZeneca, and it coincided with Brexit. And then it turned out that in January, the European Union, the European Commission, had ordered way too few vaccines of all types, Moderna and Pfizer included, and that AstraZeneca was unable to deliver as many as it had pledged to deliver. And so The real crisis that we're now seeing get worse, in fact, in Europe, was exacerbated by AstraZeneca's failure to deliver what it had pledged to deliver. We then had, I think, what now turns out to be exaggerated or unsubstantiated claims that AstraZeneca could trigger blood clots and thrombosis and some deaths in people. It turns out that that isn't true, that it isn't backed up by scientific evidence. It's anecdotal. But a number of countries, starting with Germany, temporarily suspended AstraZeneca, thereby making the shortage of vaccines and the slowness of Europe's rollout even worse. Now, the European Medicines Agency, which is their equivalent of the FDA, says it's perfectly safe to use. In Britain, 17 million people have been given AstraZeneca shots, and there's no higher death rate there from blood clots than there is amongst the population that hasn't been given AstraZeneca shots. So the politics of this is where the real problem is. And if you look across Europe, if you look at opinion polls, large majorities now, particularly in France, which is a home to vaccine skepticism, to anti-vaxxer sentiment, they're saying they're going to refuse to take AstraZeneca. So even if they do get the supply they want and do lift the suspensions of its use, the population is basically now biased against it. It's not a happy story, the European Union and vaccine rollout. It's a serious crisis for Brussels.
All right, joining us now, infectious diseases physician and medical director of the Special Pathogens Unit at the Boston University School of Medicine, Dr. Nahid Bhadilya. She's an NBC News and MSNBC medical contributor. And Dr. Bhadilya, just from, the piece of video we showed from Miami alone, the real weak spot in our society is going to be the young people who don't get it. And aside from shutting everything down, it seems like we need this vaccine out there as fast as possible. How is that balanced? Because social distancing guidelines are great, but in order to get people to actually not spread this virus, we're going to have to lock everything down again. How quickly is it possible, given what's out there, to get that vaccine in everybody's arms?
Yeah, Mika, this morning, the news from AstraZeneca is one step towards that, right? Because we already have an arsenal of doses of AstraZeneca. And so this study, 32,000 people, basically shows very good efficacy in general from symptomatic disease, but really good, protection from death and hospitalization and severe disease, as you mentioned, is going to be one more step towards it. So I'll tell you the good news. The good news is the more people they get vaccinated over the next few months, even with the type of, changes in behavior, population behavior that you're seeing, like the stuff in Miami, hopefully, even if we have a big surge, the fourth surge, hopefully the mortality and hospitalizations will be lower than what we saw with prior surge, because we have vaccinated some of the most vulnerable people. But people of all age get hospitalized. Because there are 50-year-olds, 40-year-olds of my age who have comorbidities, medical conditions, who get hospitalized and die from this disease. And so having only 13% of our population vaccinated at this point does not take us out into clear blue skies yet. And the AstraZeneca vaccine, as Ed Luce, is going to be an important step because it has normal refrigeration. I think they did an analysis in their study, the press release that they released, that they showed no differences in the incidence of these blood clots. And so it'll be interesting to see the data and the FDA evaluation of it, because it definitely is a tool that we need.
Jonathan Lemire is with us and has a question for you, Doctor. Jonathan.
Good morning, Doctor. If past is prologue, it seems like every time Europe has a surge, it comes here just a couple of weeks later. So my question to you is, how concerned are you about what you're seeing in Europe? We've seen the decline in cases across the U.S., slow. They sort of plateaued and even ticked up in a couple of regions. And what can be done to convince Americans who are so hesitant to take the vaccine? What can be done to make them get these shots?
Yeah, Jonathan, I think that what we have in our advantage is that we are vaccinating more people per 100, citizens than Europe is. But we are also, I think there's a lot more pandemic fatigue now than there was in the first two waves. And what doesn't help is, many governors of many states sort of just saying things are back to normal because people take signal of what is allowed as what is safe. And that's what you're seeing is that combined pandemic fatigue, you're just seeing people let their guard down. I do think, though, that I'm heartened to see that there is a lot of demand. Yes, the path to herd immunity or, this version of America where most of us are vaccinated immune such that we no longer have this outbreak, there are real hurdles to that. One is the vaccine hesitancy. The other is if we have uneven distributions, right? If you have, even before COVID, like if you look at measles, what happened in 2019 is you had the most number of cases since 1992 with a disease that we've had a vaccine for decades, partly because you had pockets of communities that did not take the vaccine at the same amount. And we need to avoid that. We need to target those communities, give them the information that they need, and work on that disinformation.
Well, and we've spoken about this before, Rev. I just seen some new numbers though, talking about skepticism among communities of people of color. A recent NAACP survey showed that only 14% of young Black Americans expect to get the vaccine. And you've talked about this in the past, talked about how progress needs to be made, especially since it is Black Americans who have disproportionately been impacted by COVID-19. What can be done? What is your organization doing? What are others doing to try to educate not just young Black Americans, but all Americans that this is safe, much safer than not taking the vaccine?
First thing is that we had to deal with the accessibility of the vaccine, and I think that there's been a lot of strides. In fact, today in the state of New York, there's going to be the announcement of churches that now will act as places where people can come get vaccinated. And what that does is not only give access, Joe, it also gives places that people have trusted and know, both young and Black, that they would not feel that these houses of worship where they married and buried their dead and has been a backbone of their families, whether they were attendees or not, would not be the place where the vaccines were given if it were not safe. I'm going to get my second shot today as soon as I leave the show. So I think as people that have fought and been in the trenches for the community stand up and say, this is better than not taking it, it gives a trust that people that have been strange and in some cases alien to us have been advising us against history. Those of us that have fought to continue the traditions of history of making our communities safe need to stand up and stand out. But we must have stations of access. That's why we're doing what we're doing in New York today.
All right, Rev. Dr. Naheed Bedelia, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning. Great to see you. And Ed Luce, great to see you as well. Thank you for being on this morning.
Could I ask Ed really quickly about your most recent column about Joe Biden? There are a lot of American economists who are concerned that we're just basically pumping the economy with an infusion of cash. And that it's going to burn off eventually, and it's going to be just one more bubble that this country's experienced over the past 20 years. From what you've seen and what you've written, explain why you think it may be more.
So I think the pandemic, as we've observed across many fronts, has changed it's been a sea change in American politics, and stuff that you wouldn't have imagined happening a year ago is now considered not just sort of mainstream, but likely. We're going to get a boom at some point later this year. Once we reach something like herd immunity, once in-person services come back, all these savings that Americans have built up in their savings account are going to be spent. We're going to have high growth, and it's going to last for 6, 8, 9, 12 months catch-up growth. And then we'll revert to trend growth. I think the opportunity here that Biden has with this change in politics is to really shift middle class earning power in a way that, we haven't seen since maybe the Great Society of the 1960s or even the New Deal of the 1930s. This is a window of opportunity to address middle class income stagnation, which has been dogging America since the 70s, with the brief exception of the 1990s when there was middle class growth. And I think that window is going to slam shut pretty quickly. So Biden has the opportunity, as unlikely as he might be as the sort of vector of this, to be an historic president who could take the sting out of populism as well by addressing this pessimism that has dogged America's middle class, and by doing so permanently with big structural reforms.
All right, Ed Luce, thank you. And coming up, the message from the president and vice president to the Asian American community in Atlanta in the wake of last week's murders. We'll play those remarks next on Morning Joe.
What does her ascension mean to you?
Ask a simple question.
Everything. She is the first woman of color vice president.
Ask everyone you know what matters to them and why.
Let's be clear. This isn't about fraud.
Work the angles.
Tonight here on MSNBC, we've got a special coming up.
Question authority.
What specifically are you going to do?
Walk me through your process.
Care about what you find.
If not now, when? And if not us, the free press, then who?
And if what you discover doesn't match your expectations,
Can you fact check this for us?
keep asking yourself hard questions.
Are you confident in that?
Be tough on the answers.
It's just not true.
Favor facts over conspiracies.
What should American citizens know?
Rely on experts, not influencers.
They're now going to debate it again and vote again.
And trust standards over hearsay. At MSNBC, this is what we do, and this is who we are.
Whatever the motivation, we know this. Too many Asian Americans have been walking up and down the streets and worrying, waking up each morning the past year feeling their safety and the safety of their loved ones are at stake. They've been attacked, blamed, scapegoated, and harassed. They've been verbally assaulted, physically assaulted, killed. But for all the good that laws can do, we have to change our hearts. Hate can have no safe harbor in America.
Racism is real in America, and it has always been. Xenophobia is real in America, and always has been. Sexism, too. Ultimately, this is about who we are as a nation. This is about how we treat people with dignity and respect. Everyone has the right to go to work, to go to school, to walk down the street and be safe. And also the right to be recognized as an American, not as the other, not as them, but as us.
The president and vice president on Friday addressing the rise in hate incidents against Asian Americans. The president is now urging Congress to pass the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which aims to increase Justice Department oversight of COVID-related hate crimes and make hate crimes information more accessible to the Asian American community. Now to the concerns of another community that too often feels unprotected and the group that's stepping up to do something about it. They're known as the NFAC, an unarmed all-black militia. You might have seen an armed black militia that you might have seen at protests in Georgia, Kentucky, and D.C. Joining us now from Atlanta with more on this, NBC News correspondent Morgan Radford. Morgan, tell us about this group.
Mika, good morning. The bottom line is this group says that the U.S. government, as well as law enforcement, simply does not do enough to protect black Americans in this country, which is why they say they're taking matters into their own hands. And interestingly, Mika, this is a group that is growing. They say they now boast recruits in nearly every single state. So we decided to go and embed with them and see exactly what they're doing and why. Take a listen.
Where's her?
The sounds of war
right here at home. This is the NFAC, an all-black militia with a mission to defend the black community by any means necessary.
So this is training for one of the new chapters.
Yes. Appearing by the hundreds at protests from Stone Mountain, Georgia to Louisville, Kentucky, demanding justice for police killings and countering what they believe is the threat of right-wing militias. It's a movement started in 2017 by this man, former musician and Army veteran John Grandmaster J. Johnson.
Is the movement growing?
By leaps and bounds.
We met with him outside of Cincinnati, where he says another new chapter is now in the works.
The NFAC stands for the Not Effing Around Coalition.
What's behind the name?
The NFAC was born out of the last 4 years under the Trump administration. The deterioration of racial relations in this country. It means that you're preparing yourselves to defend yourselves.
While the group's style echoes the Black Panther Party of the 1960s, their goals are distinct, focusing on defense with the ultimate goal of a black ethno-state.
What makes us so different is that our goal is our own government, our own country, a place where we can determine our own future.
Is violence an option to reach your goals?
The United States was built on violence being an option. Violence should be the last option.
Extremism experts say the group is distinct from far-right militias.
They have not risen to the level of concern of, say, the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers. They have not engaged in violence. In fact, in most of their demonstrations, they have, in fact, coordinated their activities with police.
When you talk about January 6th, and we saw those rioters storm the Capitol, what do you say to critics who say you're no different from them?
Where we have done those things, they've killed people. They've disrespected the government to the point where they have invaded its sacred halls. Show me where we've done those things, because we have done none of them.
We were allowed rare access to one of their training sites at a secret location in rural Georgia.
We are now driving to the NFAC training facility.
We spoke to one member who chose to go by the code name Shy to protect her anonymity.
This one is the handgun.
Correct, yes.
And then what do you guys do next?
We are going to the area where we practice our primary weapons firing.
Why did you decide to join this movement?
It's for the cause. Black people, we need to learn how to defend ourselves. This is definitely one way to do it.
Do you all, have normal jobs? You work in all different sectors? And
Absolutely. We're business owners, we're doctors, lawyers, we're your everyday person, anywhere from Walmart to the corporate sector.
What are you all training for?
We're training for self-defense.
A response to show they won't be scared or unprotected any longer.
Mika, we asked the group several times to give us an exact number of their membership. They refused to do so, but it appears to be in the thousands based on the number of people who have come to their marches and also based on the number of people who saw at one individual training session. But it's also important to note, Mika, that the NFAC has no record of violent incidents. However, their leader, Grandmaster Jay, has been recently indicted on federal charges by federal officials who allege that he pointed a rifle at officers during that demonstration in support of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky last September. That case is ongoing. He has pleaded not guilty, and we are waiting to find out the results of that case, Mika.
Right. Morgan Radford, thank you for that incredible report.
So, Reverend Al, it's interesting. I think back to the 1960s, reading about unrest in specifically Los Angeles. And suddenly there were white legislators when black Americans were getting armed. There were white legislators in California who suddenly supported gun control. Then that changed. It's going to be curious to see what happens. We're so used to seeing white, middle-aged guys with military-style weapons hanging out around state legislatures and just walking around casually with them. It's going to be interesting to see what reaction it is when it's not white guys doing that outside of state legislatures, but it's actually an organized black militia.
I agree. It will be interesting. And what I think is also interesting is that we've not seen this group go to state legislators or go to any places of government and threaten them. It is really surprising to me that we've not seen more groups grow in the black community before, given that you had what happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashid Brooks, all happened within a short span of time. It is a natural thing for some people to say we're going to defend ourselves. Now, I come out of the Martin Luther King school of thought of nonviolent resistance, but I grew up at a time that I saw the Panthers form, even though I was in another part of the movement. I do note, though, that they've said they're not going to be offensive. They're there for defense, and that violence is a last resort. Those of us in the King movement don't believe in violence, but I do think that they are a lot different than the aggressive or seditious groups that we're seeing on the right. We'll see where it goes.
Well, I think just generally, Mika, it's insanity that state legislators in Michigan and other states allow anybody to carry military-style weapons like into a legislative body or as we saw during the election, carrying around AR-15 or AR-15 style weapons around voting locations when things are as heated as they are. If that's what they think what the definition of the Second Amendment is, they probably should go back and read what Scalia wrote in Heller, because that's not what that reads.